Hello, my name is Vanessa de Oliveira Andreotti. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia and Canada Research Chair in Race Inequalities and Global Change. The University of British Columbia is located on unceded territories of the Musqueam people, who are speakers of the Ho'okame'elam language. And I'm speaking today from the Musqueam Reserve, which is where I live. So today I've been asked to tell you a story. It's the story of the House of Modernity. And this story was created from the literature of post-colonial, decolonial, critical race studies, and indigenous studies, but also in workshops with indigenous communities in Latin America. So it was a double effort. And as a story, it is not meant to describe something accurately. Indigenous stories are told to move things in us, to draw our attention to certain aspects of things, to paradoxes, to complexities, in ways that make us relate very differently to language. That's why it's presented as a story. We also talk about it as a social cartography, as a creative social cartography that is post-representational, that is not meant to offer a normative theory of anything, but it is meant to create different kinds of conversations that are difficult without relationships falling apart. So the version of the story of the House of Modernity I'm going to tell you today starts with the frame where there's a house that is sitting on a planet, and the house exceeds the limits of the planet. The foundation of the house is the foundation of separability, the separation between humans and the rest of nature. We're also nature, but we like that separation. And this separation is based on human exceptionalism. So we are exceptional, we are better than the other humans, and we're here to have a very different relationship with nature. And it's a relationship where we manage nature, where the planet is perceived as property or resource to be managed. And so are the other animals. They are perceived as resources, and their value is calculated accordingly. However, the value of humans is also calculated in a similar way, because the sense of separation eliminates the intrinsic value of life. When everything is together in nature, there's an intrinsic value of life. When there is this separation, that value goes, and for us to feel validated, for us to feel that we have worth, we need to be producing value in modernity's economies to receive that external validation. So that separation, or separability as we call it, creates hierarchies of worth between humans and non-humans, between humans and between cultures as well, because it's also based on modernity's economies, right? And there are different kinds of economies, not just material economies. There are intellectual economies, affective economies, relational economies that ascribe different kinds of worth to different bodies, to different types of work, to different individuals. The house has two carrying walls. The first carrying wall is the carrying wall of the nation state. The nation states promises securities and belonging, but in a very constructed way. So especially if you're thinking about Canada, Canada is a settler state. So the occupation of indigenous lands is what enables Canada. And there are many other examples where we can see that the modern nation state is an institution that was created to protect property, not necessarily people. And we have examples from critical race theory, for example, that show that the protection of people has only happened through granting of civil rights, labor rights, or even human rights, when these rights for people were convergent with the rights of capital. When it was useful for the protection of property to protect people, there was interest convergence, and then the nation state says yes. When that convergence is not there, the state will tend to protect capital over people. So this is one of the things that is interesting to discuss, because we generally think about governments for the people, by the people. We vote for people to be there representing us. But we forget that historically and systemically, this may work very differently. So in the story of modernity, the nation state is one of the carrying walls, and it's a carrying wall that protects property over anything else. And the next carrying wall is the carrying wall of universal reason. Universal reason is the idea that we can describe reality objectively in order to be able to control it and to engineer a perfect society. But in doing so, in making definitions that are universal, we also eliminate other possibilities of understanding reality. We create a single story of progress, development, and human evolution, with certain people heading humanity and other people falling behind or following those who are heading or dragging behind. So discourses about science, development, progress are all embedded, are all tiles in that wall, and they delegitimize other possibilities for understanding the world and relating to the world and being in the world, other ways of knowing and being, in a way that creates what Boaventura de Souza Santos calls Epistemicize, right? It kills the possibilities of other forms of knowledge. It looks at the people who hold these forms of knowledge as inferior to those who abide by the single story, and it renders their livelihoods impossible. So this kind of epistemicides are necessary for genocides and ecocides to happen. So when we delegitimize a group's way of understanding and being in the world, we are also delegitimizing the ways that they live, and then justifying domination or elimination through this logic. The current roof of the house is the roof of global financial speculative or shareholder capitalism. And many people have referred to this form of capitalism as destructive capitalism, because it bets on failure, basically, to be able to make profit, right? So it's focused on anonymous shareholders who are only invested in the production of profit through interest or through speculation. And if you look at this house now, there have been other types of roofs, and if you think about this house in different parts of the world, there are other walls that are more decorative, and each country will create its own walls. But the structural part of the house today in most places remains the same. And I think the first frame is drawing attention to the idea that the planet is becoming too small for this house. So the house exceeds the limits of the planet, and we will probably have to face the consequences of that. The second frame is the frame of hidden costs. So inside of the house, you see unsustainable growth and overconsumption. Unsustainable growth refers to the idea that exponential growth in the finite planet is unsustainable. Overconsumption is this way of being where our mode of engagement with the world is through consumption, but not just of stuff, but also of relationships, of knowledge, of experiences, of people. And it tries to problematize that. So inside the house, you have unsustainable growth and overconsumption. And then you have two arrows. One arrow bringing what the house would say are resources from the planet into the house. So it's the arrow of expropriation. And another arrow going from the house to the planet as waste disposal. And then in the planet, what you see is destitution, dispossession, genocides, and ecocides. So the house, what this frame tries to show is that the house is subsidized and maintained by violence. It was created on the backs of people and planet, and the violence this construction is not something that is visibilized, that is rendered visible within the house. So what else can be said about this frame? This frame also talks about the costs, right? Who are we indebted to? So one of the stories that we have for this frame is the story of a group of students trying to calculate the real costs of an iPad. So we look at the iPad today and perhaps it costs $1,000, but we try to calculate costs in a much more comprehensive way, in understanding environmental costs, health costs, historical costs too, from mining the minerals for the iPad to the disposal process, but not only today, like in our time, but also in the past and in the future. So who pays the cost of an iPad? And of course, it's almost impossible to calculate these costs. And we didn't have the means to do that at the time, but we came up with more or less 30,000 to think about if all the labor involved in this iPad was fair labor, fairly paid, and if we had calculated that resource extraction, for example, was also done in a fair way, that the costs for even the users and the people who live in the sites where mining happens, if we were thinking about their health and well-being, how much it would cost. So we came up with a figure that was $30,000. And if we look at that figure, we pay 1,000. Who pays 29? Or who are we indebted to for 29 for every iPad that is in the market? And that helps us. It is a problematic calculation in many ways, but and it is still a calculation, right? Which is also problematic in itself. But to think about justice and to think about health and well-being, but it gives us an idea that there are invisibilized costs in the creation and maintenance of the house, and that there is a debt that people have been paying historically and systemically with their lives and their health, and that their children are still going to have to pay. And it is a kind of accumulated debt, right? We tend to think that it is the people in the majority world. I don't call it third world or developing world because these are offensive terms, but the majority world or the low-income countries, we tend to think that they owe us something, but it's actually the other way around. And that frame tries to highlight that. The third frame is about floors. So you have, we're playing here with global north and global south, these ideas of global north and global south, which are ideas that I use in my work as well. So inside the house, we have the north of the north as the penthouse. And these are people who have had their financial security and privileges secured for a long time. Then there is the north of the south and the stairs of social mobility in the middle. So these are people who are committed to establishing their financial security and privileges for a long time, following the lead of the north of the north. And then there's the south of the south, south of the north, which is the basement of the house, where people who are not invested in social mobility create their communities. They are not invested in social mobilities, but they are the ones who sustain the stairs. So they are going to be the people who do the cleaning up, the cooking, the caring for the children of the people who are invested in the social mobility ladder. And then in the planet, we have the south of the south, and also almost drowning in the sewage that is placed on the south of the south by the house. And these are people who are either defending other ways of existing in the world, or having their livelihoods destroyed by the cost of the house, right? So some of them might have lost already the possibility of living the lives outside of the house, and they are knocking on the door and saying, let me in, because that's the only secure space that I can see for me to be. Others are going to be fighting and involved in high intensity struggle to keep their ways of being, their ways of life outside of the house. So they disidentify with the house and try to fight for their own ways. So, for example, we work with the Hunikui communities in the Amazon. They see themselves as the guardians of the forest. They are fighting against carbon trading, which is the UN authorized, one of the UN authorized ways of fighting climate change. They say that carbon trading commodifies the forest. Some indigenous communities are for it because they receive money to keep the forests intact. But what the Hunikui people are saying is that their relationship to the forest is not a transactional relationship. And carbon trading actually changes the relationship when it's implemented and can jeopardize the governance and also their land claims. So they are pushing back against that. They're saying that what we actually need is a different way of being in the world, not based on consumption, and that carbon trading offsets the cost of consumption. By claiming it offsets the cost of consumption, it actually is increasing consumption, which is bad for the forest. So this is an example of how the South of the South fighting for something that is different from the house. And this frame also highlights that the promise of universal middle class for all is a false promise, because in terms of the planet, it's not going to be possible. But also, if we expand the house, we also have to expand the violence that creates and sustains the house. So it's a false promise, both in terms of the violence that is required for the house and the unsustainability of the house itself. The next frame, which is the fourth frame, is the frame where the house is cracking. So you have there climate change or climate crisis, economic instability, the cancellation of rights, precarity, populism, and structural damage in the roof. And then you have inside of the house socioeconomic, political, ecological, and mental health crisis, and in the planet now completely filled with the sewage, violent conflict, mass and forced migration. And underneath the house, you see fix it, expand it, build another house, live without a house, find more planets to live, like Elon Musk wants to do. So here we arrive at the question of how do we reckon with all the human wrongs that have happened so far, and by learning the lessons from the mistakes of the past, how do we figure out what to do today and how to make only new mistakes in the future? What do we do with this house? How can we learn from this house? How can we be taught by the house itself? When we created this image, we were not yet in the pandemic. This image was created 2 or 3 years ago, but we're thinking about how the pandemic itself changes the story. And a new version will come up later this year. Now, in the next row, we're going to skip the reasoning of the house, and we're going to go to the 3 other frames of the house that you see at the bottom, and then we'll do the reasoning last. So for those inside the house who have to address the question of fixing, expanding, building another, living without, once we live inside the house and get used to the comforts, enjoyments, and securities and safeties that the house offers, we also get caught in an affective and relational feedback loop that is very difficult to interrupt, especially if we think that we just need to think differently or imagine differently and we will be out of this mess. It's not as simple, because we are affectively invested in the house and relationally constrained also by the house. So the first frame of the house at the bottom talks about how the house creates and harnesses fears. So, for example, the fear of scarcity. The house promises that it's going to address that fear for you. So it first fuels the fears and then gives you a promise that I will address that. So the fear of scarcity then becomes, in the next frame, a desire, a compensatory desire for accumulation within the house. And then this compensatory desire for accumulation becomes a perceived entitlement for ownership, for property ownership. And the same happens with other fears, desires, and entitlements. For example, the fear of uncertainty becomes a desire for certainty. That then becomes a perceived entitlement for stability. Fear of chaos becomes a desire for control. That then become a perceived entitlement for order, and so on and so forth. So our fears of loss, pain, death are all harnessed by the house. Then they become desires for us to stay within the house, and then entitlements for us to protect the house and safeguard the house. And this is extremely difficult to interrupt. And as the house starts to fall apart, you will see that as people start to protect those entitlements, we might see an increase of violence, a lot of polarization, and things that, like what we saw over the weekend, and in terms of seeing people going to protests and others taking up arms to protect property. So this is an example of how this feedback loop operates and how difficult it is to interrupt it. So we're going to go back to the reasoning of the house, which is the box with a little body underneath it. We call it Boxhead. And Boxhead is the kind of parameters of thinking and intelligibility that we see within the house. And you will see inside Boxhead the maxim, I think, therefore I am, but there's also, I say, therefore it is, I own, therefore I rule, I lead, therefore you follow, I arbitrate, therefore you comply, and I rock, therefore you suck. And around it, around the box, you will see lots of big words like dialectical, utility maximizing, logocentric, evolutionary, Cartesian, teleological, anthropocentric, and allocronic. These are types of thinking. These are grammars of thinking that are necessary. If you don't think in that way, you're not going to be intelligible. What you say is not going to be imaginable within the house. So it's very difficult to also shift patterns of thinking, because there is a grammar of language that you need to use to be intelligible within the house. For example, I'll take two of those words. Utility maximizing, it's the way of speaking where what you say has to have something in it for the person who you are saying it to. So people are only going to engage in the movement if there's something related to their self-interest. And then we think that this is universal, but this is not universal. This is a particular way of thinking that we have been socialized to and we've become comfortable with and that we've been rewarded for, that then becomes very difficult to interrupt. It's going to be painful to interrupt this and to see that there are other ways of relating and imagining and sensing and reasoning about things. I'm also going to look at the word allocronic. Allocronic is a word that connects time and color. And allocronic is a word used in critical race theory to talk about how we tend to think about whiteness and white bodies as the apex of evolution, and all the other bodies, or civilization, and all the other bodies lagging behind or trying to catch up with that. So we think about here and now in terms of modernity and in association with whiteness. And we think about there and then in association with racialization. this is again one of these patterns of thinking that is not conscious only, right? So in this frame, what we have is an illustration of how our unconscious has been colonized and how difficult it is to work with that colonization, or to even be aware of that colonization, because Boxhead itself focuses on consciousness rather than the unconscious. But underneath Boxhead, you have a few words like the erotic, the aesthetic, the intuitive, the ludic, which is the playful, the divine, the hilarious, and the other than human. These are things that interrupt the drawing of the box, because there are two ways of looking at this picture. One is that there's a box and you can think outside of the box, which is a desire that comes from the box. So every time we try to think outside of the box, we're probably reproducing the box in a different way. But there are things that come from, there are unconscious forces or forces that work through the unconscious that can interrupt the drawing of the box, which is another way of looking at it. And at the very bottom, you see being reduced to knowing. So the kind of ontometaphysics, the way of being within the house, is a way of being where my being is what I know. Right? So we really think that knowledge is the grounding platform for existence, because we believe that we are the only ones who can reason, all the other animals can't. And I think it comes from that. It also comes from separability. So there are other ways of being where knowledge is not the center of existence. Knowledge is one thing amongst other things that are components of existence, but knowledge is not central. And it's very difficult for Boxhead to imagine that. That's why Boxhead is always trying to change knowledge rather than change other things that may be behind knowledge and may even be more effective in the changes we want to see. And in relation to this, another thing that has come up in our collective, I work with the Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures Collective, which is what I should have said from the beginning, is a narrative that talks about the neurobiology of the house. It is a speculative narrative. We are in conversation with neuroscientists about the chemistry of the house, but we're not neuroscientists. So what I'm going to say is just speculative and metaphorical. So we talk about separability, creating deficiency in serotonin in the bodies of those people who are used and socialized to the house and who would prefer continuing to live in that house, who receive their comforts from the house, which is all of us. So there is a serotogenic deficiency. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that gives us the sensation that we're connected with everything. So indigenous communities, through their ceremonies, they have ceremonies that keep the production of serotonin in your guts at very high levels, to really feel, not just think about how the earth is alive. The earth is a metabolism. The forest is alive. We are part of something much bigger than ourselves that is organic, that is material, but it's also spiritual. So they use serotonin as the grounding force for that. And this serotonin changes everything in terms of the configuration of our neurobiology and neurofunctionality. So it's not just serotonin. It's a much more complex catalysis that happens that changes how our nervous system operates and how we relate to the world through that. So we tried in this metaphor of neurochemistry to think about how modernity could be a drug pusher and keep us addicted to a certain configuration of being, chemical configuration of being. And we mapped dopamine, oxytocin, endorphins, and adrenaline as the cocktail that keeps us going within modernity. So since we cannot feel connected with everything, we have to be much more individualized. We still produce some serotonin, but not enough for us to challenge the house. So they give us dopamine. Dopamine is the sense of reward, of beating somebody or getting likes on Facebook or feeling that you have achieved something and receiving the accolades. That's the dopaminic hit. Oxytocin is something that is produced between mothers and babies, for example, and it's very important in the protection of the babies in the stages where the baby cannot really fend for itself. But if not in that context, if relationships are grounded on oxytocin at an adult level, they're infantilizing relationships. They're very projective. So you would, and very transactional, you would relate to somebody as long as this person validates you in the way that you want to be seen. And if that person doesn't do that, you go and you discard that person and look for somebody else. So if our relationships are grounded just on oxytocin, they are not grown-up relationships. They are relationships where we consume other people and we project a lot on what this relationship should be. We're not really engaged in the hard work that is to grow up together, basically. Endorphins are the body's opioids, right? So that's pain, it's for pain relief. And if we get that kind of addiction, it works like opioid addiction too, because the threshold that you need to feel a little bit better to not feel pain is higher. So within modernity, we already relate to pain in a very different way. Like the idea of well-being within modernity is that you have to be pain-free to feel well. And that's not the idea of other societies either. They have a very different relationship with pain. There's a very good book called Towards Scarring Your Soul, Our Soul, and that talks about that I would recommend. But if we are dependent on endorphins to numb to pain all the time, and if you're afraid of pain or terrorized by it or haunted by it, we are going to be building this threshold. And it may also work as, for example, when we call something out in a critique, something that was invisibilized and it becomes visible. You might get a hit of endorphin, like, oh, thank God, like this pain that I feel now has become visible. However, if it becomes a pattern, you're going to be calling out a lot of things just to feel that relief, right? And that can then affect other things. It can fragment communities, especially communities of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. So you see that pattern of outrage for relief operating sometimes in these communities. And adrenaline is the neurotransmitter of that combines dare and fear, and it's also the neurotransmitter of transgression. So when when you're probably tired of being numbed, you want to feel alive. It's adrenaline that you're going to seek, right? And sometimes putting yourself at risk, sometimes just through outrage against other communities, but adrenaline then combined with dopamine or combined with oxytocin or endorphin, it will create different scenarios for how you may want to feel alive within the house of modernity. And we use this to talk about what we're missing out. So there are many other neurochemical configurations that Indigenous people have been using and trying, and there are probably many other ones we haven't even discovered yet, that we call these things exiled capacities. So the capacities that have been exiled by the house. And they are not just thinking capacities, they are neurobiological, they are neurochemical and neurofunctional. So there are other ways of being that could help us approach the question of what to do with the house very differently. But there's some work that needs to be done right now before the storm, or we call it the shitstorm, that is coming with everything, right, that is coming towards the house and all the turmoil that is going to take place. There's some work that we need to do in relation to our cognition, our affective investments, our relational possibilities that might open up possibilities that are viable but unimaginable within the house. So the story of the house is about preparing us to face the storm together in ways that we don't shoot each other, and not seeing the fall of the house as something that we have to contribute to, but something that we need to hospice the house. We need to offer palliative care, learn from its mistakes, be taught by it now that it is falling apart, so that we can build something else in the future. So it's time to step up, grow up, and show up differently to each other by learning to exist differently. So that's the story of the house.